Southern Sector, Kursk Salient, July 5, 1943, 04:30 hours. The wheat moved first, not from wind, from steel. In the dim light before sunrise, the fields south of Oboyan trembled beneath the weight of German armor. Panzer IVs rolled forward, in disciplined intervals. Tigers followed behind, their long 80mm barrels pointed toward a horizon still wrapped in mist. Engines roared low and steady. Tracks crushed soil hardened by weeks of preparation. Inside the lead tank, the commander scanned through his optics. The terrain ahead appeared empty, no visible trenches, no moving armor, no muzzle flashes, just farmland. Then the first impact came, a sharp metallic crack. The second tank in the column burst into flame. No smoke trail revealed the shooter. No flash marked its position. Only another strike, precise, deliberate, slamming into the side armor of a third Panzer. Within seconds, 3 machines were burning. The column halted. Turrets turned wildly. Crews searched for an enemy that did not seem to exist, but the gun was there, hidden, waiting, and it had already begun erasing an entire armored advance. February 1943. The frozen ruins of Stalingrad still smoldered when the scale of Germany's defeat became undeniable. The Sixth Army had surrendered. Nearly 300,000 Axis soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. For the first time in the war, the myth of German operational invincibility had cracked in full view of the world. Yet the Wehrmacht was not collapsing. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched a counterstroke in March 1943 that retook Kharkov. German armored forces demonstrated that they could still maneuver with speed and precision. But this victory created something dangerous. A bulge. On the Eastern Front map, a vast protrusion now jutted westward into German lines around the city of Kursk. Nearly 250 kilometers wide and 160 kilometers deep, the Kursk salient was an invitation. If struck simultaneously from north and south, Soviet armies inside it could be encircled and destroyed. Adolf Hitler saw opportunity. The proposed offensive was named Operation Citadel. It would be the last great German armored offensive in the East. New heavy tanks, Tigers, new assault guns, Ferdinands, improved Panzer IVs with long-barreled 75mm guns, concentrated force, decisive blow. But time was not neutral. While German planners delayed to mass forces and introduce new equipment, the Soviet High Command was watching. Marshal Georgy Zhukov and the Stavka received intelligence from multiple sources, reconnaissance, captured documents, and even Allied code-breaking relays. They knew an offensive was coming. They did not intend to meet it in open maneuver. They would wait. Instead of attacking first, the Red Army chose something unprecedented in scale. Defense. In depth. Layer upon layer of anti-tank belts. Minefields. Artillery zones. Concealed gun positions. Camouflaged strong points stretching dozens of kilometers. By early July 1943, nearly 1.3 million Soviet soldiers occupied the Kursk salient. More than 20,000 artillery pieces and mortars, thousands of anti-tank guns, over 3,000 tanks held in reserve. The Germans saw a bulge to eliminate. The Soviets saw a trap to construct. To the south, near Belgorod and Oboyan, German Army Group South under Manstein prepared to drive northward. To the north, near Orel, General Walter Model's Ninth Army would strike southward. Between them lay fields that had been quietly transformed into killing grounds. Operation Citadel was no longer just an offensive. It was a test of armored doctrine. Mobility versus preparation, shock versus patience, steel versus concealment. And beneath the soil of Kursk, unseen weapons were already waiting for the first engine to start. By the summer of 1943, the German army believed it understood armored warfare better than any nation on earth. Blitzkrieg had carried panzer divisions across Poland, France, the Balkans, and deep into Soviet territory. Tanks moved fast. Combined arms followed. Shock shattered resistance. But Kursk was not France. It was not 1941. Operation Citadel would involve some of Germany's most formidable machines. The long-barreled Panzer IV AOSF G and H models now carried a high-velocity 75mm gun, capable of penetrating most Soviet armor at range. The Tiger I, armed with the 80mm KWK-36, could destroy a T-34 at well over a kilometer. The newly introduced Ferdinand tank destroyer mounted an even more powerful 80mm Pak-43. On paper, the advantage appeared clear. German armored strength allocated for Citadel totaled roughly 2,700 tanks and assault guns across the northern and southern pincers. Army Group South alone fielded elite formations, including the WWII SS Panzer Corps. But the Red Army had learned from catastrophe. After the disasters of 1941 and 1942, Soviet doctrine shifted toward elastic defense combined with concentrated anti-tank fire. Instead of relying solely on mobile tank counterattacks, Soviet planners built what they called anti-tank regions, dense networks of overlapping fields of fire designed to break armored momentum. These were not isolated guns hidden randomly. In fields, they were structured systems. The Soviets deployed tens of thousands of mines, anti-tank and anti-personnel, in belts sometimes 5 to 6 kilometers deep. Engineers dug trenches zigzagging through farmland. Camouflaged gun pits were reinforced with timber and earth. Firing arcs were carefully measured. Ranges were pre-calculated. At the heart of this system was the Pakfront concept. A Pakfront was a coordinated grouping of anti-tank guns placed under centralized fire control. Instead of firing individually when a target appeared, several guns would engage the same tank simultaneously. Crossfire, concentration, shock. The most common weapon was the 76.2mm ZIS-3 field gun, versatile, reliable, and deadly at typical combat ranges. Lighter 45mm guns were positioned forward to damage tracks and optics. Heavier 57mm ZIS-2 guns were held to penetrate thicker armor. Behind them, artillery batteries waited to strike halted formations. Crucially, concealment was meticulous. Gun barrels were wrapped in foliage. Firing positions were dug below the level of surrounding terrain. Crews remained silent until ordered. No premature shots, no revealing flashes. The goal was to remain invisible until the moment of maximum vulnerability. German reconnaissance observed trenches and mines. They expected resistance, but they underestimated density. Many German officers believed Soviet anti-tank guns could be suppressed once identified. They assumed forward momentum and superior optics would allow them to neutralize static defenses. What they did not yet understand was that these guns were not isolated obstacles. They were layered ambush networks designed to erase entire spearheads, before commanders could even identify the source of fire. On the southern axis near Belgorod, fields that looked empty contained dozens of concealed weapons positioned in depth. When one line opened fire, the next remained silent, waiting for survivors. By the evening of July 4th, German assault units were in final staging areas. Engines were checked, ammunition loaded, orders distributed. At 04:30 on July 5th, artillery would open the largest preparatory bombardment yet seen on the Eastern Front. German commanders believed they were about to punch through a defensive line. They were about to drive into something far more deliberate. A Panzer IV was not spacious. 4 men operated within a confined steel compartment filled with heat, fumes, vibration, and noise. The commander stood slightly elevated in the turret, scanning through binocular sights. The gunner focused on elevation and traverse. The loader handled shells that weighed over 6 kilograms each. The driver and radio operator sat in the hull, separated by armor and machinery. When the first hit landed on July 5th, it did not announce itself with clarity. It came as impact, violent, metallic, sudden. Inside the turret, a sharp clang echoed through steel walls. Instruments shook. Dust fell from internal seams. The commander's headset crackled with confused voices from other tanks. Someone shouted coordinates that did not match any visible enemy. Through the optics, nothing appeared. No advancing T-34s. No anti-tank flashes. No moving infantry. The wheat fields ahead seemed still. Then another tank erupted in flame. For a Panzer crew, the most terrifying scenario was not a visible duel with enemy armor. It was uncertainty. When a target was visible, they could aim. They could return fire. They could maneuver, but an unseen gun removed control. German armored doctrine depended on momentum. Tanks were meant to press forward, suppress threats, and exploit breakthroughs. But when vehicles began burning without a visible enemy, momentum dissolved into hesitation. In that hesitation, survival narrowed to seconds. The Soviet anti-tank defense at Kursk was not improvised. It was engineered. A typical Pakfront grouped 6 to 12 anti-tank guns under a single commander. Positions were chosen after careful reconnaissance of terrain contours. Guns were staggered, not aligned in a straight line, so that overlapping fields of fire could strike vehicles from multiple directions. The first gun might target the lead tank. The second would aim for the rear vehicle. The rest would fire into the immobilized center. This created a kill zone. Once a column halted, whether from destruction or confusion, artillery observers would radio coordinates to rear batteries. Within minutes, high explosive shells would begin landing among stalled armor. Timing was everything. Soviet gunners were trained to withhold fire until German tanks entered optimal range, often 500 meters or less. At that distance, penetration probability increased dramatically. A Panzer IV's side armor could be pierced cleanly by a 76.2 mm shell. Even Tigers, though heavily armored in front, were vulnerable from the flank or if immobilized. Camouflage enhanced lethality. Gun pits were dug slightly below crest line so that only the barrel tip protruded. Cut wheat was arranged to conceal disturbed soil. Crews remained motionless as engines approached. No premature shots. No wasted ammunition. The goal was not to trade fire. The goal was to erase the spearhead. And when German armored columns advanced, in tight formations through seemingly empty fields, they unknowingly entered pre-measured crossfire corridors that had been calculated weeks in advance. The 76.2 mm ZIS-3 field gun was not glamorous. It was not as large as the German 88 mm. It did not carry the mythic reputation of heavy tank guns, but it possessed three qualities that made it lethal at Kursk: simplicity, mobility, and reliability. Designed by Vasily Grabin, the ZIS-3 combined the barrel of an anti-tank gun with the carriage of a field artillery piece. It could fire armor-piercing rounds, high-explosive shells, and fragmentation ammunition. Its effective anti-tank range extended beyond 1,000 meters under ideal conditions, though most engagements occurred much closer. Crucially, it was mass-produced. By 1943, thousands were available. Quantity mattered. Each gun crew typically consisted of 6 to 8 men. They trained to reposition quickly, to repair damage under fire, and to maintain discipline under pressure. Ammunition was stacked nearby in dugouts. Range tables were memorized. Against a Panzer IV, the ZIS-3 was deadly at combat range. Against a Tiger, frontal penetration was unlikely, but track hits, side shots, or concentrated fire could immobilize even the heaviest tank. And once immobilized, a tank became artillery bait. German crews had faced anti-tank guns before. What shocked them at Kursk was not the existence of the weapon, it was its invisibility, its coordination, and its concentration. The battlefield was no longer defined by maneuver alone. It had become a network of concealed steel. Waiting patiently beneath open sky, Marshal Georgy Zhukov had learned hard lessons. In 1941, Soviet armies had attempted immediate counteroffensives against German breakthroughs. The result had often been encirclement and destruction. But by 1943, Soviet operational thinking matured. Instead of rushing to blunt German armor with hurried tank assaults, Zhukov recommended absorbing the blow first. Defense in depth required discipline. It required resisting the instinct to strike prematurely. Stavka ordered frontline commanders not to waste anti-tank assets in scattered engagements. Guns were to remain concealed until German spearheads committed fully. Counterattacks with tank reserves would only begin once the enemy's momentum faltered. This patience was strategic. German doctrine depended on tempo. Once that tempo stalled, coordination frayed, supply columns lagged, air support struggled to adapt. Armored formations lost cohesion. Zhukov's design for Kursk was not simply defensive, it was accumulative. Every destroyed tank weakened future German offensive capacity. Every immobilized column reduced operational options. He understood that Germany could not easily replace elite panzer crews. The invisible guns were not random obstacles. They were instruments of attrition, placed deliberately to grind down the most sophisticated armored force in Europe. German reconnaissance before Operation Citadel was extensive. Aerial photographs revealed trench lines and mine belts. Prisoner interrogations hinted at strong defenses. Commanders expected resistance. What they misjudged was scale. Many German planners believed Soviet defensive belts would collapse after concentrated artillery preparation. Luftwaffe strikes targeted suspected gun positions. Heavy bombardments opened the offensive at dawn on July 5th, but concealment and depth limited the effectiveness of this preparation. Soviet guns were dispersed in layers. Destroying forward positions did not eliminate the next belt behind them. Mines slowed engineering units. Clearing operations consumed time. German officers were also influenced by past experience. In earlier campaigns, static defenses often broke once armored formations penetrated initial lines. At Kursk, penetration did not equal collapse. Instead, every kilometer gained brought new concentrations of anti-tank fire. Fields that appeared cleared would suddenly erupt with coordinated volleys. Reports from forward units described unseen guns and invisible batteries. The battlefield seemed alive. Intelligence had identified the presence of anti-tank defenses. It had not anticipated the density required to erase entire columns within minutes. Armored warfare is as much psychological as mechanical. Tank crews rely on confidence in armor thickness and firepower in doctrine, the belief that forward motion protects you, the belief that superior optics and training will prevail. When tanks burn without visible enemies, confidence erodes. On July 5th and 6th, reports from Panzer units described confusion. Radio chatter overlapped. Commanders demanded coordinates that subordinates could not provide. Some crews hesitated to advance without clear targets. Others pushed forward aggressively, only to trigger additional minefields and crossfires. The invisibility of the threat magnified fear. A visible T-34 duel is a contest. An unseen gun is a sentence. Even elite formations, including units of the II SS Panzer Corps, found their advances slowed by sudden bursts of anti-tank fire that seemed to come from nowhere. Engineers struggled to clear paths under shelling. Recovery vehicles attempting to tow damaged tanks became targets themselves. Psychological momentum, so essential to blitzkrieg, faltered. The Soviet design did not need to destroy every tank immediately, it needed to fracture certainty, and once uncertainty entered the column, the offensive no longer moved with the same inevitability. All of these pressures converged in the opening hours of the assault, when steel met preparation and doctrine collided with concealment. July 5th, 1943. Southern Sector, near Belgorod. 04:30 to 08, easier hours. The German artillery barrage began before sunrise. Thousands of shells crashed into Soviet forward lines. The ground trembled. Dust columns rose along the horizon. Luftwaffe aircraft followed, diving toward suspected strongpoints. For a moment, it appeared that the opening of Operation Citadel carried the familiar signature of earlier victories. Overwhelming firepower, synchronized assault, controlled aggression, then the armor moved. Elements of the II SS Panzer Corps advanced north toward Oboyan. Panzer IVs formed spearheads. Tigers provided overwatch. Assault engineers followed behind to breach mines. Commanders expected resistance. They did not expect silence. The first kilometers were slow but steady. Minefields detonated beneath lead vehicles. Engineers crawled forward with probes and charges. Casualties mounted, but the formation pressed on. Then the invisible guns opened fire. A single crack echoed across the fields. One Panzer IV halted abruptly, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. Seconds later, Another vehicle erupted in flame. From a side penetration, crews scrambled to identify firing positions. Turrets traversed left, then right. Gunners scanned wheat and shallow ridgelines. Nothing moved. Then 6 more guns fired at once. A coordinated volley struck the center of the advancing column. One tank lost its track. Another's turret jammed. A third burned from within after ammunition ignited. The column compressed under pressure, vehicles bunching instinctively for protection. It was the worst possible reaction. The Soviet Pakfront had waited for density. Now, immobilized tanks blocked the path forward. Rear vehicles struggled to reverse under incoming fire. Communications became chaotic. Orders overlapped. Smoke obscured visibility. Behind the anti-tank line, Soviet artillery observers radioed pre-registered coordinates. Within minutes, high explosive. Shells began landing among stalled German armor. The combined effect was devastating. The ZIS-3 guns did not reveal themselves with continuous fire. They fired, relocated slightly, fired again. Some guns were knocked out by return fire, but others remained silent until new targets presented themselves. German crews attempted flanking maneuvers, but mine belts funneled movement into narrow corridors already measured by Soviet gunners weeks earlier. In some sectors south of Kursk, entire forward companies lost operational cohesion within the first hours. Tigers, though heavily armored, found themselves immobilized by mines or track hits. Once stationary, they became artillery targets. Reports from divisional headquarters described unexpected anti-tank density and intense crossfire from concealed positions. The offensive was still advancing, but not with speed. Each kilometer required blood and steel. By mid-morning, several German columns had been reduced to scattered burning hulks across fields that only hours earlier appeared empty. And yet the full weight of the defensive system had not even revealed itself. July 6 to 10, 1943. The Southern Axis tightens. The first day had not broken the German assault. But it had slowed it. And in mechanized warfare, delay is decay. By July 6th, German armored formations pushed deeper into the defensive belts south of Kursk. Villages like Cherkaskoye and Yakovlevo became contested ground. Every advance required clearing mines under fire. Every breakthrough revealed another anti-tank line behind it. The invisible guns did not operate alone. Soviet commanders reinforced sectors under pressure. Fresh batteries were rotated forward at night. Damaged guns were replaced. Ammunition stocks were replenished through concealed trenches and communication routes dug weeks earlier. German spearheads now faced something different from earlier campaigns: cumulative resistance. A Tiger might survive multiple frontal hits from a 76.2 mm gun. But if its tracks were shattered by a 45 mm shell, its optics damaged, and its supporting vehicles destroyed, the tank became isolated. Once isolated, artillery would finish what anti-tank fire began. The density of fire increased. At several critical junctures, Pakfront groupings engaged simultaneously from overlapping angles. German after-action reports later described instances where as many as 10 anti-tank guns fired at a single armored cluster within seconds. The effect was disorienting. Tank commanders could not identify a singular threat to eliminate. Suppressing one gun did not silence the others. Destroying a forward position often revealed secondary lines further back. The battlefield turned into a layered furnace. On July 8th and 9th, progress measured in kilometers cost dozens of vehicles. Panzer regiments that began the offensive at near full strength reported operational readiness reduced significantly within days. Recovery crews worked continuously, but many damaged tanks lay in exposed fields under intermittent shelling. Then came Prokhorovka. July 12, 1943. One of the most intense armored engagements of the war erupted when Soviet reserves launched a massive counterattack. While the clash at Prokhorovka involved direct tank engagements between T-34s and German armor, the preceding days of attritional anti-tank defense had already drained the German offensive's momentum. The invisible guns had done their work. German formations reached the limits of sustainable advance. Ammunition consumption soared. Replacement vehicles were scarce. Air superiority wavered as Allied operations in the Mediterranean demanded Luftwaffe resources elsewhere. Then strategic reality intervened. On July 13th, Adolf Hitler ordered Operation Citadel halted. Allied forces had landed in Sicily. Germany could no longer commit reserves indefinitely to the Eastern Front. The offensive ended not in a sweeping breakthrough but in exhaustion. The Kursk salient remained. German panzer forces had not been annihilated, but they had been bled and, for the first time on the Eastern Front, a major German summer offensive had failed to achieve decisive operational success. The invisible guns did not win the war in a single day. They eroded the spearhead. They broke rhythm. They transformed fields into attritional traps where speed meant vulnerability. From that moment forward, the strategic initiative shifted permanently eastward. When Operation Citadel was halted on July 13, 1943, it marked more than the end of a single offensive. It marked the last time the German army would initiate a large-scale strategic assault. On the Eastern Front, the losses were not catastrophic in isolation. Germany did not lose every tank committed to Kursk. Many damaged vehicles were repaired. Tigers and Panthers would continue fighting for 2 more years. But the deeper loss was structural. Between July 5 and July 13, German forces committed approximately 2,700 armored vehicles across the northern and southern axes. Estimates vary, but hundreds were destroyed outright, and many more were disabled or heavily damaged. More critically, experienced crews, veterans of France, the Balkans, and early Barbarossa, were killed or wounded. Armored warfare depends, not only on machines, but on trained men inside them. Replacing a tank was difficult. Replacing a seasoned commander who could read terrain under fire was nearly impossible. In the weeks following the halted offensive, the Red Army seized the initiative. On July 12th, even as Citadel stalled, Soviet forces launched Operation Kutuzov against the German-held Oral salient in the north. Shortly afterward came Operation Rumyantsev in the south. The defensive belts that had absorbed the German blow now served as springboards. Cities once retaken by Manstein earlier in the year fell again. Kharkov changed hands permanently in August 1943. German forces began a gradual withdrawal westward, a retreat that would not truly end until Berlin itself. Kursk was not a sudden collapse. It was a pivot. The German High Command had believed that a concentrated armored strike could restore strategic balance after Stalingrad. Instead, the attempt accelerated imbalance. Material losses, though serious, were secondary to what had changed psychologically and operationally. The Red Army had demonstrated mastery of defense in depth on an industrial scale. The invisible anti-tank belts proved that German armored doctrine, designed for fluid maneuver, could be neutralized through preparation, coordination, and patience. After Kursk, German planners increasingly relied on defensive operations. Panzer divisions were redeployed reactively rather than offensively. Fuel shortages intensified. Air superiority steadily shifted as Soviet aviation expanded. And within armored units themselves, the experience of advancing into unseen crossfire lingered. Reports emphasized caution. Momentum, once assumed as default, now required verification. The field south of Kursk had delivered a message written in steel and fire. The age of effortless armored breakthrough was over. The consequences of Kursk extended far beyond the burned hulls left in wheat fields. By late summer 1943, the Red Army was advancing across a broad front. The Dnieper River became the next defensive line. German forces, stretched thin, attempted to stabilize positions while evacuating equipment under constant pressure. The initiative no longer belonged to Berlin. The armored balance had shifted permanently. Before Kursk, German panzer divisions retained the ability to choose when and where to strike. After Kursk, they increasingly reacted to Soviet offensives. The industrial disparity between the two sides widened each month. Soviet factories east of the Urals were producing T-34s, artillery pieces, and anti-tank guns in quantities Germany could not match. The ZIS-3 continued rolling off assembly lines in staggering numbers. By war's end, more than 100,000 had been produced. It became one of the most widely manufactured field guns of the conflict, a symbol of Soviet industrial resilience. German heavy armor programs, meanwhile, became more complex and resource-intensive. The Panther and Tiger were formidable machines, but they required maintenance, fuel, and experienced crews. On a battlefield increasingly shaped by attrition and layered defense, mechanical superiority alone could not guarantee operational freedom. Strategically, Kursk removed any remaining illusion that Germany could regain long-term initiative in the east. The Wehrmacht would fight fiercely in subsequent campaigns, at the Dnieper, in Belarus, in Hungary, but always while yielding ground over time. Psychologically, the myth of unstoppable armored thrust was gone. For Soviet commanders, Kursk validated defensive doctrine and centralized fire control of anti-tank groupings. The Pakfront concept evolved further in later operations, integrating more mobile anti-tank units and self-propelled guns. For German crews, memory lingered. Veterans recalled advancing into fields that appeared empty, only to watch their columns vanish under coordinated fire. The shock was not merely physical destruction. It was the realization that concealment and preparation could nullify speed and steel. The invisible gun was not a single weapon. It was a system, a convergence of planning, industrial production, intelligence, and discipline. It proved that armor without reconnaissance, without flexibility, and without adaptation could be drawn into a trap built quietly over weeks. From July 1943 onward, the Eastern Front became a prolonged defensive struggle for Germany, one fought with determination but without strategic recovery. And the smoke that once rose from the Kursk fields became the signal of a broader transformation in modern warfare. In the early years of the Second World War, armored columns symbolized inevitability. Steel moved forward, nations fell back. But in July 1943, on the open fields around Kursk, something shifted. The battlefield no longer belonged solely to speed or to the thickest armor. It belonged to preparation, to concealment, to coordination. The German Panzer. Crews who advanced that morning did not face a single miraculous weapon hidden in the wheat. They encountered the quiet result of months of calculation, mines laid by hand, guns measured to precise angles, fire plans rehearsed in silence. The invisible gun was not invisible because it was advanced. It was invisible because it waited. Kursk did not end the war. It did not immediately destroy German armored power, but it marked the moment when momentum changed direction. From that summer onward, the Red Army advanced steadily west. The initiative never fully returned to Berlin. What began as a bold attempt to restore dominance instead confirmed that industrial endurance and defensive depth could absorb even the most concentrated armored thrust. The burning columns at Kursk were not just losses in a ledger. They were evidence that modern warfare had entered a new phase, one where visibility could deceive, where patience could overpower speed, and where an unseen line of guns could reshape the course of a continent. And in those silent fields beneath the smoke and